Good afternoon. At this time, we'd like to call to order the Palo Alto City Council Rail Committee meeting for Wednesday, August 21st, 2024. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Councilmember Lithcott-Hames.
Here.
Councilmember Lowing.
Here.
Chair Burt.
Here.
All present.
Great. So our first item is an opportunity for members of the public to speak on any item that is not on the agenda, but which is within the purview of this committee. Do we have any members of the public who want to speak?
No hands are raised and we have not received any speaker cards.
Okay, so we can move right on to our updates from different agencies, first Caltrain, then VTA, and then our own city staff. And then we'll move on to our single action item, which is discussion of quiet zones. So I don't see Caltrain staff here. Philip, do you have any updates on their behalf?
Thank you very much. Philip Kemi, Chief Transportation Official. I'll give a series of updates, and some of them will involve the various different agencies. The first update that I have is regarding the quiet zone projects, which will be our action item for later today. Just want to note that for the Palo Alto Avenue crossing, we've received comments from the different agencies on our 70% plans, and the consultant's currently working on completing the 100% plans, specifications and estimates. And the consultant's also working on the GO 88B application that needs to be submitted to the CPUC along with the 100% plans. For Churchill, Meadow, and Charleston crossings, we'll have a presentation later today on that. I'm actually just trying to confirm, and maybe the clerk can confirm for me, do we have Blake here? I'm not seeing Blake. Blake Silkwood? Oh, sorry, I didn't know you were in person. Excellent. Okay. Blake Silkwood is our consultant with Kimley Horn for the quiet zones. The next item that I have is regarding the safety improvements for the fencing. Caltrain's currently working on finalizing the plans, specifications, and estimate for the fencing installation. And the project involves replacing the existing 6-foot fencing with a 9.5-foot fence with, I guess, what you call like a winglet. And the base bid involves around 3,000 linear feet. And an alternative bid also includes approximately another 1,000 linear feet of fencing. We're coordinating with Caltrain on maximizing the limits of this installation and making sure that there's adequate funding for the proposed improvements along the corridor. And we are currently waiting on Caltrain to receive their bids and to discuss the outcome of the bids. And then at that time, we'd want to consider recommendations to the improvements and potentially additional funding that might be necessary. On grants, just to give a few quick updates. I think we previously shared that CalSTA was at some risk with the governor's proposal to rescind the funding because the Great Separation was funded out of general funds. Just to note that the city had worked with state representatives and other partner agencies to preserve the funding. And it appears to have been successful. Of course, we do need to get a little bit closer, but this is for the funding that we have for final design, the TIRCP funding. So not this next phase that we're about to move into, the phase after that. The one thing that's a little bit unclear still is how they're going to prioritize and allocate the funding to the different projects because really the language that they kind of stressed was shovel-ready projects, and our project would be helping to get a project shovel-ready, but not really necessarily shovel-ready until you have final designs. So that's going to be something that we're going to have to monitor as we get closer. The next note is on the FRA agreement, which is our grant for this next phase, and that agreement's fully executed now. And so we're working on the funding allocation, which is actually expected to be ready sometime at the end of next month, September 2024. And then finally, to Chair Burt's question regarding our next phase of the project, which is the preliminary engineering and environmental phase. Following that recent council direction or last council direction on the grade separation projects on June 10th and June 18th, staff has been collaborating with Caltrain and Santa Clara Valley Transportation Authority to develop a cooperative agreement for this next phase. Noting that we're going to be using the Measure B funding, so we need a cooperative agreement, and it's really going to be a 3-agency agreement that we are negotiating. And we expect to bring that agreement for Rail Committee's review at the next meeting, September. And so that will set out the questions that you asked. That's going to set out the roles and responsibilities, and that's when we'll be able to take input on that. And with that, that concludes my, I'm sorry, one last thing. September 21st is Caltrain Electrification's first day of service. And there'll be a celebration of that. I guess that's the right word to call it, in Palo Alto. And all rides on Caltrain September 21st and 22nd are going to be free. So check out the new trains, and turn it over to Chair Burt if you wanted to add anything on to that.
Both that and on a couple of other things before we go to comments. So yeah, it's going to be a big event. They've had a number of events up and down the corridor in San Francisco, Millbrae, San Francisco, where people get to get on board the samples of the electrified trains. This will actually be the day that all trains in the corridor will be the new electrified trains. This event is actually going to be one not just focus on a Palo Alto audience, but it's going to be the main event for the corridor for that official launch date. So we think it's going to be a big deal. The partner agencies of the city, Caltrain, Stanford, VTA, Samtrans are all going to be participants in having different information and food and music and all those kinds of things, because part of what we want to make sure is that the characteristic of our center as being a true multimodal center is emphasized. And we have all these bus agencies. Reminder that our intermodal center is the largest bus station in Santa Clara County. And it's not all VTA buses because we have Samtrans, AC Transit, Marguerite, and we're the second largest Caltrain boarding station. The station itself has been getting spruced up. And I don't know if anybody's been there lately, but it's where a lot of progress is happening there. So it should be exciting. Second, on what Philip mentioned on the TIRCIP funding, I just want to give recognition to that when those dollars were threatened, we pulled together a consortium, kind of a quick ad hoc consortium of everybody who really cared about maintaining those funds. So the 3 cities of Burlingame, Palo Alto, and Mountain View, the agencies of Caltrain and VTA, and then our state legislators really joined in. And then as Philip mentioned, it's the way the legislation ended up going is that the legislature said, okay, we're not going to fund them this year, but we're going to direct the California Transportation Authority to prioritize the funding of this out of the dollars that they allocate. And fortunately, we had as part of this consortium, Carl Guardino, the former CEO of Silicon Valley Leadership Group, who is chair of the California Transportation Commission, and Carl has really gone to bat for us on that. So I think we want to really take our chance to thank our legislators and everybody else who helped save those dollars. And then on the fencing, I just wanted to make sure everybody understood this is funding that was earmarked for the city of Palo Alto by Congresswoman Eshoo and former, still Congresswoman Jackie Spear. And that was 2 years ago. It was allocated. It's taken this long for the dollars to get out locally and for us to identify how much fencing we can get for is it $800,000? I think that was the dollar amount.
Yeah.
So that's really great that we got that. And as you may know, we have almost all of the east side of the corridor already having this type of fencing. And now we're trying to fill the remaining gaps and really make it more secure. And then I just want to note one other thing that came out just today in the news related to Caltrain and grade separations, which is that the cost estimate for the Burlingame grade separation, they got updated estimates reflecting what's happened in recent years of the ballooning in costs for civil engineering projects like grade separations, like the BART tunnel and everything else. And their dollar estimate for completion went from, I think it was 360 million to 600 million, which really reflects on what we're likely to see on some cost estimates for our own grade separations, which goes into our discussions we've had and will continue to have on what's likely to be feasible, what's really likely to be needed, given that we no longer have on the foreseeable horizon the increase in number of Caltrain trains that were projected pre-COVID, nor the increase in traffic and population growth for the region that was previously projected. And so it makes it, as I've mentioned before, I think something that will influence our consideration on how many grade crossings we will separate in the foreseeable future. And we've prioritized the South Palo Alto grade separations as the top priority. And so the implication is that Churchill is probably even further off and less funded than was anticipated previously. So those are kind of all pretty significant things for us to all kind of let sink in and adjust our thinking over time on. Questions from colleagues? Ed?
I had only one that was actually just a slight add-on to what you asked. What's the gap on funding for those fences? I mean, if we spend the 600,000, how much more do we have to come up with? Because you said additional funding sources.
Yeah, we're unsure because they're
Okay.
collecting bids.
But is the question how much we would need to have citywide full secure fencing on both sides of the tracks completed? Is that your question?
It is, but it sounds like you're still digging that out.
Caltrain's still waiting on the bids.
And when we got these dollars, we were anticipating that they would be used for our highest priority remaining fencing,
Sure.
but not an assumption that it would complete both sides. I should add that I've been pushing Caltrain, and they have now adopted as a strategic goal to corridor-wide begin the process of building off of their steady increase in investments in security and safety, and instead set a goal of corridor-wide best practices of security and safety. We have automated crossings, our detection systems, and otherwise there are new technologies even beyond where we are that have come on to availability and the security. And so Caltrain is just beginning the process of appraising what would be involved with the corridor-wide best practices from San Francisco to San Jose at a minimum, what it would cost, and how to pursue funding and implement it. So it's going to be a very extensive program, but we've sadly seen an increase in accidents and fatalities throughout the corridor. And Caltrain as an organization is really recognizing that aside from the over $10 billion it would take to fully grade separate, where you could have full security, it's very important to go these next steps and provide significant improvement in safety and security before that can be done.
And my other question is, since you brought that up, in terms of the Burlingame estimates, what additional data do we need from staff or other people to have a serious conversation about perhaps we only emphasize the South and Churchill gets put on ice for a while?
Well, it's a little chicken and egg. If Philip might want to speak to this, but that's part of going forward with our next step on the 15% engineering.
Yeah.
It enables
Certainly.
a better cost estimate. And so we can, in our own minds, begin to kind of digest and anticipate what might be the outcomes, but it's going to be tough to get to decision points until we have updated numbers. And my understanding is those will go hand in hand with the engineering. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Thank you.
Julie?
Congrats on the on landing the September 21st date and location right here in Palo Alto for the celebration. I'm curious about how an event like that can even be pulled off, given the number of agencies and entities involved. Who is actually organizing the food and the drink and the music? How did you make that happen?
So Caltrain's the lead agency. We were going to have it in June, and the June event really wasn't going to be as comprehensive as the San Jose and San Francisco and Millbrae events. And I advocated for postponing it so that we could really get all the partner agencies. Stanford is very engaged because they really have a lot of vested interest in the success of Caltrain and that station as a backbone for their transportation program in the hospitals, I should say. It's not all the Stanford entities. VTA actually sublets and manages the actual core station area. The land is owned by Stanford, leased to the city, sublet to VTA. And we're the southern terminal for Samtrans. And Samtrans, frankly, has a great, both an interest in that station, and we have an interest in Samtrans participation, because when we look at the next phases of upgrades to that station through quirky aspects of regional funding, they have access to what are called the RM3 dollars that could be in a part of the funding source for what we're doing there, at least for the design part. And so all those agencies, including AC Transit, have an interest, and Caltrain is really the coordinator of it, and they're doing a lot of great work, but it's a partnership.
Yeah.
And that's our station's a lot different from almost every other station, in that, like, Dearborn is all Caltrain owned. And so you got one entity, you got others that care about it. VTA is very much involved. Millbrae has BART there, but nobody has as many players as we do. And so it's both a challenge in terms of having one entity take leadership, but an opportunity in terms of ability to collaborate.
Yeah, exactly. I was seeing the challenge and seeing evidently something beautiful is coming out of it. And that takes a lot of skill and a
Well,
lot of.
Tell us how good it was on September 22nd. Yeah.
It sounds
I think
great,
it's gonna be
Pat.
good.
Okay,
Yeah.
good, good. for you.
Caltrain deserves a great deal of credit for it.
Good. That's it.
Okay, do we have any members of the public who want to speak on this item?
Yes, we have one hand.
Great.
Our first speaker is Adrian B.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the unmute. That's pretty disappointing to hear about that cost escalation in Burlingame on their Broadway grade separation. I believe Councilman Birch said 600 plus million. I'd like to just point out that 4 times that amount equals the entire price tag of the system-wide electrification and new, the modernization with the new sleek Swiss electric trains. So, so just to put it in perspective, grade crossings, when we grade separate them, do not speed up the trains one bit. There's a common misbelief that people think trains have to slow down for grade crossings, or that it in any way affects the train service, which it doesn't, except for when there are incidents. So that's primarily the benefit of a grade separation, is incident avoidance, and that's accidental incident avoidance, not intentional. And also, of course, the schedule delays and the delays to motorists that have to wait some additional time for trains to go by. So, in light of the fact that we're probably not going to see a lot of increased train service in the near future, it does kind of call into question the transportation value of doing grade separations when they're coming now at 600 million apiece. That's a quarter of the entire Caltrain modernization and electrification price tag. And that's probably why the High Speed Rail Authority and their EIR declined to do any further grade separations. They're just going to install quad gates as you're planning with the quiet zone. And that will permit safely running up to 110 miles an hour, and also with the regulators. On the last point, I just wanted to make, the Golden Gate Bridge just finished their suicide net finally. And there were several articles talking about how suicides continued where the gaps were until the net was complete, which is just pointing out that, the net or the fencing is only as good as your weakest link. And on Caltrain, our weakest link is the stations. They're completely accessible. And unlike on BART, where suicides even occur there at closed stations with fare gates, we have completely open stations, and someone that wants to do harm looks no different than somebody waiting for the train. And the difference between life and death and stepping from a position of safety into a position of death is a matter of seconds. So it's a very, very difficult problem to solve. And I think we're kidding ourselves if we think grade separations will do any more than stop primarily accidental incidents. And intentional ones, such as, in Palo Alto, there are 3 different opportunities. We have 3 stations, essentially: San Antonio, Cal Lab, University. So just to keep that in mind in terms of.
That concludes public comment.
Thank you. And I want to correct myself. The Burlingame cost is to go over 600 million, but the previous cost was not 360 million, it was 316. So it's pretty close to doubling. And I will just, for the record, I really want to emphasize that we at Caltrain and within the city of Palo Alto have engaged with real national experts on track safety and security and fatalities, and the preponderance of both evidence and perspective of experts is that there is real value in addressing essentially hotspots that for the most part, folks who might use a given location do not, if you interrupt an incident, it does not result in a subsequent fatality elsewhere in most circumstances. And so this is a topic that is really left to true experts, and I think it's kind of harmful if we are doing our own speculation that may be based upon conjecture. Okay. Any other questions or comments on the updates? I know, Philip, one other thing, when you talked about the progress of the quiet zone at Palo Alto Avenue, what does that mean in terms of a timeline?
Sorry to say, I'm going to look at Blake and see if he might know better than I, but unfortunately, because Rippon's not here, I don't have much more beyond the current, that we're trying to get to the 100%. Then we have to go through the process of getting the approvals, and we really don't totally know how long that can take. We would like to, since it is, as you are aware, not that complicated a project, once we actually get it approved, we think that we can probably move to actually getting it constructed, pending a public works project. We wouldn't just go out and do that on its own. It'd be paired with other projects. We think that it could be moved forward pretty quickly. It's really that timeline for getting approvals.
Great. And Blake, do you have any
No.
insights? Okay. All right. So I think that concludes our updates, and now we'll move on to our single action item, which is a review and discussion of the initial analysis of the city's quiet zone implementation project at the existing grade crossings at Churchill, Meadow, and Charleston. That's because we're separated on the discussion at Palo Alto Avenue, which people think of as Alma, but it's Palo Alto Avenue. So it's for those 3 locations. Take it away.
Yeah, thank you. Well, with that introduction, we can probably just go to the next slide. We don't need to talk about this one. This is just an overview of the presentation. And next slide, please. So the purpose of this study is to explore the implementation of a quiet zone in the locations that were discussed. Noting that the purpose of a quiet zone, in case you're tuning in for the first time here, is to create a section of railroad where the trains do not need to routinely sound their horns at the crossings, provided that there's specific safety measures that have been implemented to ensure that the crossings are safer without the horns. The study identifies and assesses where the necessary modifications are needed at the crossings in order to meet the federal requirements for establishing a quiet zone. And the aim is to reduce noise impacts on the community while ensuring that all rail crossings continue to meet strict safety requirements. Next slide. We talked about the Palo Alto Quiet Zone project just before the lead into this, but that's on a separate path. And this current study focuses on Churchill, Meadow, and Charleston crossings. To guide this project, we have engaged with Kimley Horn, and sitting next to me is Blake, who already kind of got an introduction to, Blake Silkwood from Kimley Horn. And they're conducting this detailed quiet zone analysis and reviewing the existing conditions at all of the crossings. And they've been determining what safety improvements are necessary in order to potentially meet the quiet zone requirements. And after identification, the recommendations will be, once we have direction for which ones, we would submit those recommendations to the Federal Rail Administration and the California Public Utilities Commission to ensure compliance with their regulations. Alongside this technical work, we will continue to engage with community members to gather their input and to share updates. And the end goal is to develop a comprehensive implementation plan that balances safety, regulatory requirements, and community needs. Next slide, please. So the quiet zone analysis, obviously, I mentioned that it's based on the existing conditions at Churchill, Meadow, and Charleston. And the consultant evaluated the current safety measures and used what's known as the Federal Rail Administration's Quiet Zone Calculator to assess potential improvements. And based on this analysis, they developed several options that could meet the minimum criteria for implementing quiet zones at these crossings. The findings from this technical review have been compiled into a technical memo, which outlines the existing conditions and the proposed improvement. And this document will really guide our next steps in this project. Next slide. This is probably the most critical slide, and probably after the presentation, we might want to come back to this slide. But these are the 4 main options that we have for implementing quiet zones at the locations. Option 1 involves upgrading all 3 crossings to include quad gate systems. And if anybody's curious or wants to see a diagram of that, we do have a slide in the back that shows that. But that option would ensure the greatest reduction in risk, and it's the most straightforward path to achieving quiet zone approval because it automatically qualifies for quiet zone status under the Federal Rail Administration guidelines. So that's the staff recommended option because of that straightforward path. Option 2 would involve upgrading a minimum subset of crossings, potentially 2 out of 3 to quad gate systems. And by strategically upgrading specific crossings, we could still meet the federal requirements for establishing a quiet zone, although the overall risk reduction would be less than option 1. Option 3 looks at alternative safety measures, which include roadway changes or other engineering modifications. However, because they don't provide the same level of guaranteed risk reduction as quad gates, it would really require more frequent recertification by the FRA and is, I guess, a little less predictable. And then finally, option 4 would be is a proposal to install wayside horns, which would be placed at all the crossings to reduce train noise, and would provide some noise relief. It doesn't really meet the requirements to establish a full quiet zone. So staff would, if this option is considered, it would only be recommended by staff as an interim measure. Next slide, please. So looking ahead, these are the next steps. We would refine the approach by incorporating feedback that we receive from key stakeholders, including community members, the regulatory agencies, and the technical experts. And based on this input, we'll develop a preliminary concept design that reflects the community safety improvements at each crossing. And then following this, we would conduct a diagnostic meeting with the relevant authorities, including the FRA and the CPUC, to ensure that our plans comply with the federal and state requirements. And community outreach will continue to be a priority throughout this process, and we will seek to engage residents and get their feedback on this process. And then once the preliminary concepts are refined, we'll finalize the conceptual plans. And the final step in this phase would be to seek approval from both the Rail Committee and the City Council before moving forward with detailed design and implementation. And next slide. So this is just a summary of recommendations and next steps. Really spoke to this earlier, but this is an opportunity for Rail Committee to review this initial study findings, ask questions from the consultant, and then direct staff in order to proceed with the development of conceptual plans and the implementation. So with that, happy to take any questions. And if you don't mind landing back on that options slide, well, otherwise, happy to go to any other slide that you'd like to.
And just so everybody knows that at the back of these slides, you've provided a great summary of from Kimley Horn of kind of the context of quiet zones, different designs and images that I think are really helpful and informative for people to see what these all look like and how they function.
Yeah, so happy to show any of those as questions come up, or if you want to see anything. But as an example, quad gates is on one of those slides if you wanted to see what quad gates, conceptually looks like.
Great. Questions before we hear from the public? Ed?
We'll ask the question after we hear from the public.
Okay. I'll just ask a couple. The fourth option that's listed as the wayside horns, I think it'd be real helpful if everyone can get an understanding of how much noise reduction comes from wayside horns, and for that matter, how much noise reduction we will be getting from the electric trains versus the diesel trains. And so we have the horn noise, and then we have just the train rumbling noise. We will still have the diesel freight trains at night, but come September 21st, and really actually right now they're starting to, we're having a mix of the electric trains on the line. They're significantly quieter. even though they're still blowing their horns. And so having the public understand how much improvement there is in actually quantifiable noise levels. And when we talk about noise, we have all these different ways we talk about it, because we have the peak decibel levels and then other measurements. When you have a rumbling noise, it may not be as high a decibel level, but you still have a lot of perception. We have noise that's different when, and this goes into the wayside horns. You can have the same decibel level, but when you have horns on a train moving, first they initiate, 20 or 30 seconds or before the grade. So that's like a half a mile away is when they initiate. And they can be heard at that spot, plus and minus down the track. So it's over a half mile away that a horn is blasting for a given grade crossing. When it's a wayside horn, it's only at that location. And so they have a lot of reduction overall, although there are needs to mitigate very localized noise that can happen from the wayside horns. So there are design features there. So we hadn't talked much about the wayside horns. And as Philip pointed out, they are an approach that could occur separate from this preceding or instead of the full quiet zones at one location or even all of them as alternatives. And we need to begin to have an understanding of what would be the level of noise reduction benefit that we would get from that on the wayside horns, because to date we really haven't had much of that, but I'm really glad it's presented there. Do any of the backup slides go into depth on wayside horns? I didn't pick up on that if it did. I don't think so. Okay. And then do we, or can we get any kind of rough notion of the cost, not only of the full proposals, but the comparative costs of the options? I know that getting the full detail costs will be based upon a given location, but getting some order of magnitude sense of how these compare in costs and what's kind of the range of costs of option 1, the range of 2 and 3, et cetera. I think that would be valuable for us, because it's having a discussion and providing feedback without that context is difficult. And then time frame for construction is how now on the Palo Alto Avenue, Philip said really the time frame is most of all on that location. It's about getting the approvals and permitting. That's a simplified construction by comparison, and so it's quick, but these others have a bit longer in construction, so getting that sense. And then one of the things that we need to make sure we're understanding and how it plays in is at Churchill, which is Caltrain has rated their highest crossings with the greatest number of vehicular collisions. And Churchill, I think if I'm remembering right, the top 5 crossings attribute almost half of those collisions. Number 1, I believe, is Churchill. It's number 1. As a result, Churchill is a focus area by Caltrain, and we have a pilot that's being done there of a whole series of measures, pavement painting measures, and things that will give greater clarity to drivers where they're supposed to be and where they're not supposed to be. There's just, people are confused and they go follow Google Maps. That's literally one of the things that Caltrain is engaging with Google on, is to not have the GPS tell the driver turn down the tracks, which they literally do frequently. So are you familiar with that pilot program at Churchill, and can we get an explanation of that before we go into this deeper discussion?
Yeah, so I'm sorry, the pilot program at Churchill, can you say that again? Sorry.
That not our pedestrian crossing. It's a pilot of best practices of a whole series of intersection kind of communications to driver through. And I don't remember all of the elements of it, but that is in a pretty near term that is due to be implemented. And it doesn't make it quieter, but it intersects with the safety considerations that we'll be looking at.
Yeah, I unfortunately, I don't have a lot of details on this. We'd need
Okay.
Caltrain to provide that.
Okay, well, let's ask them to give us an update on that, maybe next meeting. So any other feedback on kind of the cost comparisons and as well as the wayside horn issues?
Yeah, so I'll give you my high level, and then Blake will tell me if I'm incorrect on this. But a study that I read showed that wayside horns can reduce the decibels by around 13. So a train horn is 96 to 100 decibels in the requirements. So a wayside horn would, per this study, reduce would be 13 decibels quieter than the locomotive horn. But noting that it also provides a more localized.
I think that's even bigger. Yeah.
Yeah, and that is an issue because the horn on the rail can actually be blowing much earlier, and then it's not at the localized at the intersection. Regarding, I don't know, Blake, if you have more information on that, I'd love to hear it. And then regarding the cost, I'm hoping you can help out as well, Blake.
I don't have much more to add versus the acoustical performance of the wayside horns. I think that my information is your information. As for order of magnitude cost estimates, just the one caveat is design has not been completed for any of these, so we're looking at conceptual work. But generally, you're looking at adding in 2 new gates to create that quad gate system, as well as some miscellaneous flatwork improvements. You might have to change the crossing panel locations and things of that nature. Generally, though, the 3 crossings are all pretty similar in that regard in terms of the improvements required. So I'd benchmark it in a couple $100,000 range per crossing. Those devices can be pretty expensive, and but I think it's relatively agnostic of the crossing locations.
Well, that's a lower cost than I had understood. I thought we were talking a significantly higher cost that was shared with us when we were discussing Palo Alto Avenue, and then
I thought that one was 200,000.
that one is,
Yeah.
without quad gates.
Yeah, exactly.
But that's way lower than what we had been told before. Does that seem correct?
Yeah, so I will say that the Menlo Park estimates were much higher, and I'm not sure.
They were a couple
if
$1 million.
I'm not sure if you're.
Well, yeah, and I'm not as familiar with the Menlo Park one, but there were a handful of crossings all being lumped in there. But I do think it's a couple $100,000 per crossing. Pending final design and doing a order of magnitude cost estimate.
Okay, well, that's encouraging. Much lower than I thought. Can we get a follow-up on 2 things? One is a more clear estimate of costs, and we can look at comparisons elsewhere in the corridor, although as these construction costs are going up, they may go up higher yet as well. And then on the wayside horns, I believe there are studies out there, but I don't have, I can't lay my finger on them, that really talk about not just the decibel level, but really how much reduction in horn noise there is to the community. How many, in our community, how many people would be affected by a given horn noise? So if you're blasting a high decibel horn for essentially over a half mile, because the horn noise, as you get to the crossing, it's still blasting, and so whatever distance that noise protrudes beyond its source, how much benefit does our community get from wayside horns? How much noise reduction? And I don't think anybody has a sense of, at the peak of 13 decibels, that's meaningful to have that number. Most of us don't know what that really means by comparison, but I think that's dwarfed. That's significant, but I think it's dwarfed by the real issue of the distance and basically how many homes are affected by a horn that's blasting for how long? How long do the wayside horns blast for compared to onboard horns? Yeah.
I might be able to add a little bit of light on this
Great.
because XCAP did some work on horn noise. So a couple of things. One is the horns that we currently have, as you noted, come from a distance. And they come and they play for a long distance, particularly at Meadow and Charleston, because those are less than a mile apart. So it's actually a pretty long sweeping distance where it goes. And there's two types of noise that people recognize. It's the rumble of the train, which of course we won't have now with electric, but that comes slow and steady and builds until the train's passing you and then it dissipates. The horn can be more startling, but the challenge that we have now, especially since we have so many young kids who have earbuds in and stuff, is you can hear the train noise, but you don't necessarily know if the train is blowing because it's half a mile away or it's actually at the intersection that you're at. So the advantage of the wayside horns is they're literally placed at the intersection and they have very localized noise that's meant to blast in the direct targeted area to say there is a train passing right here, right now, versus that other noise that is more of a distance noise. I'm surprised to hear how many decibel levels difference, because part of the challenge is exactly where you're standing when you measure that. So it might be 13 decibels less if you're standing exactly where the wayside horn is, but I'd argue it kind of depends even there, whether it's pointed at you or you're in the center of the tracks or where you are. So from a health benefit standpoint, it's a huge health benefit to not have to have those horns blow, period. I mean, because it's incredibly disruptive. In fact, when XCAP was looking at which grade separation would provide the best noise reduction, by far the most important factor was just the fact that the horn noise was going away, regardless of what you ended up choosing from a construction method or what the final product really looked like. So it is the single most significant thing we can do for noise. I think it'd be interesting for Caltrain to look at whether wayside horns is something that we might want to do corridor wide, because it may take us a really long time to get the money for grade separations. And as Adrian Brandt said, that doesn't really help you. But the more localized horn noise, given how we're accustomed to train noise, would actually be better from a safety perspective to be able to stop the kinds of accidents that we have where people are like, I kind of hear a train, but my radio's on in my car, right? So that could have a really significant effect, but I'd love to hear more about the costs. I also thought that our project, and I was trying to look it up, but I wasn't fast enough. I thought it was $180,000 to raise the concrete to the 18 inches that we need just for Palo Alto Avenue, which many asked, why is it $180,000 to pour 18 inches of concrete? But that's another question. I'd be interested what those cost estimates really are. I did also look up that Atherton asked for their quiet zone in 2015. They were finally granted it by 2020. It's unclear to me how long that process was, the approvals process, because it takes a while to design those things. But I did want to ask, it's my understanding that it's FRA and CPUC that decide whether we've effectively met the threshold, and that this is not a decision that lies within Caltrain's purview. Is that correct? Or does Caltrain have a vote in whether they think quiet zone is merited or not?
Your initial statement's correct. It's an FRA and CPUC decision.
So as long as we meet their formulas and their toolkit or their tool calculator, for the most part, we should be in good shape. But this isn't a political question. This is very much a mathematical safety engineering question.
This is also fascinating. I'm focused on the fact that the moving train creates the Doppler effect. So you have not only the horn coming from its source, you have how the sound changes as the thing moves. And the wayside is a blast that's stationary and really goes in a different direction. It's designed to go out toward, it almost feels like it's perpendicular. If the train noise is coming down, the wayside sounds like it's going across. I may be a little bit wrong about that, but definitely it's stationary, and definitely it's intended to blast to the people who might be on the intersecting road, which says to me that it's an entirely different set of residents who are going to hear the wayside horn. And so we're solving a problem for those who are tired of the Doppler blast, but we may have a whole new set of people who haven't been as impacted by the Doppler blast who are now getting the wayside. And how are we going to think about the impact on them without it actually happening? How are we going to study that? I'm worried we're going to hear from a whole different set of residents who are like, wait a minute, you've just created a nuisance where there never was one.
Yeah, well, unless Blake has anything to say about that, I'll just say that most the surveys that I've seen have shown that residents in areas where wayside horns have been implemented or tested have found it to be considerably less annoying. I will say that when you hear the train coming through, it blows the horn usually more than once. So it blows it ahead, and then that's, as the train's moving, and then it blows it when it's getting either at or near the intersection. So you're also getting that same effect of that wayside horn at a higher decibel at the intersection. So those people are hearing it. They're often hearing it more than the one time that you would hear the wayside horn. So I don't think, I guess just a simple answer is I don't think there's a new group of residents that are going to specifically hear this horn. I think that it will be a wayside horn would be less decibels at a more localized location is how I would describe it. Yes, and a shorter duration as well.
Well, first, I'm seeing from a member of the public that it may be 4 times that the horn is blasted for each thing. Yeah, each way. But okay.
From 5 o'clock in the morning until 1 o'clock.
Okay. And then as far as the question of whether there is an increase in a localized horn, my understanding is that that may very well be the case. So I think we need to have clarity on that. But that goes into the question of whether that can be mitigated. I mean, we have different ways. We're not trying to blast into people's backyards. So are there, just like with controlling light direction, we can do certain things to mitigate sound if there's kind of very localized impacts. I don't know how effective those are and how great the need is, but I do think that's an important thing to have flagged, and it is one of the considerations. I don't know the facts, but I'm not sanguine that it's a non-issue. Yeah.
The last thing I'll say on noise is, I've been there at the intersections now that they've started to roll out the electrics, and I've been there at Meadow when a diesel train comes north, followed seconds later by an electric coming south, and the sounds are different. The electric trains are a higher pitch. And frankly, it's kind of nice. It's just a little bit less massive a sound.
I was glancing at what some Atherton costs that would be higher today, and I don't know whether this constitutes an apples to apples comparison or close to it, but they're much higher than a couple $100,000. So I'm confused and concerned that we had one estimate a few months ago that made us think we were talking a couple $1 million. I don't know whether it was for a single or all 3. And now we're talking a much lower number that seems to be even much lower than an old number from Atherton, but I don't know how to compare those. But I think that bottom line is we're being asked to give input today, and I'm not feeling like we have enough info. So on that note, why don't we see if we have members of the public who wish to speak?
Our first speaker is John M.
Hello, members of the committee. Thank you so much for looking into this on our behalf. I would consider myself a subject matter expert because I live 150 feet from the Caltrain crossing at Lindero Drive between Meadow and Charleston. So I moved in about 22 years ago. Now with twin tracking and so forth, we probably have, I think, at least 100 trains a day. And we would love to encourage anybody who would be willing to pursue this to implement a quiet zone or the localized horn situation. It would make the quality of our lives better. We'd sleep better. We'd be less annoyed. We're very grateful that you've pursued electrification and are monitoring that. And we expect to benefit there, but we want more if you can do it. And that's all I really have to say.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Just qualitatively, have you been able to distinguish the new electric trains in the last week or two when they go by? And are you able to kind of have any feedback on how much quieter they are to you versus what we hear about numbers and decibels and everything?
Yeah, I would say there's a noticeable difference. It's quieter, but it does nothing for the horns and
Sure.
it does nothing for the bells,
No, we get
which
that.
are the rumble from the freights doesn't disappear.
Right.
So it's qualitatively better, but it still would be, there's much room for improvement. We'll put it that way.
All right.
And the other issue is if the trains are running at 5 o'clock in the morning to 1 o'clock at night, and at rush hour, when we count 30 people on the train, we wonder who's riding at 1 o'clock in the morning and 5 o'clock in the morning. And whether that trade-off of diesel trains for increased frequency of electric trains really is of value, except to Caltrain. But Caltrain, I have to say, has been a miserable neighbor for us and doesn't really contribute much to the idea of grade separation, or we haven't found them constructive or responsive to any of our concerns ever. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, back to our committee.
I'm so sorry. So we have additional public
I'm
comment.
sorry.
Our next
we go.
speaker is Melinda M.
Hello, committee. I am his wife. So for 20 years, we're in a location. I would invite all of you to come to our house and make you a cup of coffee, because we are like, here's East Meadow, here's Charleston, here's East Meadow, depending on which way you're looking. And we are right in this little cutout where you can pull into the Fairmeadow neighborhood. So we are constantly blasted. We have triple pane windows in our house. We can't open our windows. We can't have any fresh air. And we have like, we love living in Palo Alto, but we are in like the worst location because we have Alma Street, which is basically a freeway. The cars, I walk out our front door, the cars are just lined up. They're blowing car exhaust. We are also in an airplane path. So I don't know if any of you are personally affected by the situation, but I think somebody mentioned community input. We have never been surveyed. Nobody's asked us anything. And the electrification itself kept us up all night with noise and everything else. So the trains may be quieter, but I also think that the freight trains are not quieter. They're actually running in the daytime. So I keep hearing they're just running at night. They're coming through in the daytime. And I can see the train is not really full of people like it was before COVID. So I don't know if there's any, thinking about changing around that, but we are directly impacted. I would love to have somebody actually pay attention to our situation. And I'm not saying, I can think about Churchill, the people that live near there, the people that are on Park Avenue on the other side, they're all impacted, but we have like the triple, quadruple whammy where we are. So I'm just kind of shocked that now we're talking about quiet zones when we could have been talking about quiet zones before we started all this grade separation thing. And with grade separation, we're going to have to move because there's just no way that we could live there in that kind of construction. It's going to be, and not just for us, but the people who would have eminent domain and lose their property. So I would love to get a copy of this presentation about the quiet zones, if that's available. I couldn't find online any documents, but anyway, thank you for doing this. Come and have coffee. We're at 3707 Lindero. We'd be more than happy to
And your
see
time
you
is up.
there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Elizabeth A. Our next speaker is Elizabeth A.
Hi, good afternoon, city council members and staff. I am in strong support of doing something about the noise. As Nadia mentioned, because of high-speed rail, because of a lot of things, we did look at the impact of these kinds of noises, and it is really a serious issue for people's health. And right now, we are doing something which makes no sense, where trains which are trying to warn of a danger at a specific place are sounding a warning a half a mile before. Because there are two crossings right next to each other. They are sounding it a half mile before one, a half an hour after one. And you have somebody who's like the couple who just spoke from Lindero, where they're halfway between two crossings. So they're getting blasted by one train going north and one train going south. I am going to strongly encourage the council to move forward with wayside horns. They are quite affordable. I mean, I haven't seen the latest numbers, but I would say that estimate that the consultant gave for the quiet zones, I think that would probably be fair for wayside horns. I think there are some reasons which we can talk about more why I actually think to achieve real safety improvements at the intersections will be a little more complicated than using a solution which is typical for areas where you have very long freight trains and you have an issue that people trying to get around the gates to avoid waiting for 10 minutes. That's not the issue we have in those particular intersections. Wayside horns just dramatically lower the noise for basically almost everybody, and they eliminate the noise for many others. As I think Nadia mentioned, the studies that have been done so far, which are not in places usually like Palo Alto, where we have multiple grade crossings near each other with frequent trains. Even there, they are showing some, typically safety improvements because drivers are just more aware of where the noise is coming from. And I think, especially because we have trains going north and south, and they may be going at the same time, that extra clarity would actually improve the safety at these intersections. I really encourage us to move forward on those, no matter what we do with the quiet zones. I think the quiet zones will take longer than we think. And in the meantime, I think the benefits over a year for the thousands of people who will be impacted. I mean, I do a lot of trains, so everybody wants to talk to me about train stuff. They have an interest in grade crossings. They have feelings and very strong emotions about the noise. And that's really, I think, what we should focus on, and we can solve that today.
Our next speaker is Steve R.
Good afternoon. My name is Steve Rosenblum. I'm a resident of Old Palo Alto, and I support the idea of quiet zones and quad gates. I think it's a good interim solution until we can get grade separation. I think a subsidiary issue which the council really needs to look at is a question of gate downtime, which will not be affected at all by any of these noise considerations. The present schedule of Caltrain is 104 trains per day, and these new electric trains are 7-car trains. The ridership before the pandemic, there was about 70,000 boardings per day. And right now, there are around 20,000. So it's about 30% down. And the rate of increase is very slow. Even Caltrain predicts that ridership will not be up to pre-pandemic levels for at least a decade. So we're going to be stuck with gate downtimes that are presently existing, even when we do this noise reduction. So this is a question of crossing the tracks. It's not a question of noise, but the council needs to look at gate downtime again and see what that's going to be. And as if they cannot get Caltrain to reduce the frequency of service in light of the lower ridership, then the very least we can do is ask them to adjust the schedule so that the two trains in the north and south direction cross each other close enough so that the downtime of the two trains can be coordinated and reduced. Because right now, 104 trains per day calculates to an average of a train every 11.8 minutes. So if the gate needs to be down a minute or so, while the train is coming and going, then that's at least 10% gate downtime, about 1.5 minutes out of every 12 minutes. So especially during commute times on Churchill, Meadow and Charleston, there's going to be queues that don't clear. And I think that needs to be thought about. So again, with 104 trains per day and 20,000 riders, that comes out to about 192 people per train on average, which is really a laughable amount for a 7-car train. So I think Caltrain needs to really rethink its plan, and it may be that the present level of service does not fit the ridership levels for the next decade. Thank you.
Our final speaker is Adrian B.
Thank you for the unmute. Just commenting on Stephen's comments. The gate downtime is going to be optimized by a wireless crossing optimization system Caltrain is installing right now. Apart from that, more people pass through those crossings in the gate downtime than ever pass through in a vehicle in the same amount of time. So I don't think it's a bad trade-off. And in terms of just going back to I missed part of the staff presentation. I needed to move locations, but it is 104 train schedule. That's 416 blasts, mandatory 4 blasts of the horn per train. So that's 416 blasts of the mandated 96 to 110 decibels every day per day. So it is a significant noise impact. I know of people that live at Palo Commons or the Avant on El Camino Way, quite a distance from the Meadow crossing, and they complain of being able to being disturbed by the train horns even at that distance. So I do not particularly like or support the idea of wayside horns. That's not really a quiet zone. That's sort of a half-assed solution, but I understand that that's cheaper. I would also urge that in terms of making the quiet zone qualify more easily, that you bundle Palo Alto Avenue in. All the calculations assume Palo Alto Avenue was already done. If you get the quiet zone risk index reduction of Palo Alto Avenue by putting in that median, then you probably only need quad gates at one other crossing and all 4 would qualify. But instead, the way it's packaged in the staff report and the study consultant is assuming that Palo Alto Avenue is previously done as a separate project. So you're missing sort of the credit of making that median higher. That's one of the safety safety improvement that you get credit for. So that's another approach. Just confirming Caltrain has no say. The railroads have no say in quiet zone approvals whatsoever. It can be done against their wishes if necessary. And I also wanted to point out that in Europe, they don't routinely blow the horns for crossings because they have proper gate protections. And so it's largely a safety theater issue in the United States. Around the world, people that travel here and are familiar with trains are marveling at the extreme noise in our downtown, such as Redwood City, from these trains, and they do not understand what's going on with that because there is little evidence that the horn blowing really is effective anyway. And lastly, in terms of funding, pull some of the high-speed rail authority of funding forward. They are going to have to put in quad gates and quiet zones themselves. Pull that forward, work with them, just as we did with electrification, and have them help Palo Alto pay
Thank
for
you.
the
Your
quad
time
gates.
is up. That concludes public comment.
Philip?
Yeah, sorry, just want to provide some context. First, want to note that the presentation is available online along with the packet. You can download it if you click on the, I believe it's like HTML agenda, or the full packet, I believe, will also include the presentation. So just wanted to come back to what we're asking for today, and then also talk a little bit about the cost, because I just want to make sure that's explained thoroughly. I should say the cost estimates. But first, if could you pull up slide 7 for me, please? So really what we're seeking, as that's being pulled up, is to move into the next phase of this project. So we're looking for your feedback, your comments, and direction really to move into the next step, which is developing the conceptual plans in order to implement. So that would include the potentially developing the preliminary concepts for all 3 locations, conducting a diagnostic meeting, doing more community outreach, refining the conceptual plans, and then we would seek rail committee and city council's approval before we move into the implementation phase. So just want to be clear, we're not asking for implementation right now. We're just asking for to move on to the next phase of this project. Second, I just want to speak a bit, and let Blake jump in if I miss anything here, but just to speak a little bit about the cost estimates. The cost estimates are lower than what we've witnessed in Menlo Park or anywhere else. And the reason for that is because we received funding from Section 130 to already do a lot of the work that would be required for these quiet zones to be implemented. So at Churchill, as for example, we have funding from the Section 130 funding program, which is the federally funded program to eliminate hazards at grade highway rail crossings. And a lot of that work is slated to start here in the coming months. And we've also received similar funding for Charleston and Meadow to do similar projects. So a lot of the work that we would have needed to do in order to implement these quiet zones will get done through those projects. And Blake, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, just to speak that base assumption that yes, these quiet zone projects can trigger additional improvements, and that's why you can see larger costs. And I can't speak specifically to the one in Atherton, but what Philip's getting at is correct, is there's a large amount of improvements that are already programmed under a different source. And if you didn't, and we're assuming that those improvements will be constructed prior to the quiet zone. And so if that assumption is different, then those costs would be much higher because they would have to be folded in. But just wanted to clarify that because there's a whole lot of other improvements that are already being taken care of via other means.
So now I'm not sure whether the improvements at Churchill that you're referring to are the same as what I've seen at Caltrain. Are they one and the same?
No, so there was a Caltrain component to the Section 130 project, but I think there was something else that Caltrain had that was separate from this that involved something totally different. But ours is a more discrete project that was identified.
And just to confirm, the Caltrain does have a separate project where they're using some innovative pavement markings and other means of reinforcing safety at the crossing.
And I think that's pretty imminent too. That
I don't know the schedule
not
for
years.
it.
It's just
Correct.
months.
Yeah, I believe that's from my last conversation with them. They're hoping to get it done very quickly.
Great.
Yeah, and actually, just to note that our project, currently Public Works, was anticipating the paving and concrete work to begin later this month.
Okay, and so then the preliminary work that you alluded to from Section 130 funding, can you just tell us a little more about what that is and how it does relate to the quiet zone and quad gates, et cetera?
Yeah, so I'm not sure which of the things that we're doing under that project relate to the quiet zone. I'm not sure Blake can speak to that, but it involves the installation of a pre-signal, some traffic signal modifications, some lighting modifications, some resurfacing, some additional striping. Is there anything else specifically? I think there's some realignments to the sidewalks,
Yes.
in particular the pedestrian
crosswalks,
pedestrian
yes.
crossing, as at Churchill in particular that is really important?
Well, I think we don't need to see that today, but I think maybe next month it would be nice to actually see a presentation so that we and the community have a better understanding of what's happening there. I think the community, both that and we should ask Caltrain to present on their upgrades. I think that'd be very well received. Frankly, seeing some near-term progress on both safety and how that leads is doing, providing a good portion of the groundwork that would be needed for a quiet zone and reducing the costs. That all gives a real valuable context for that. So I think that would be good to get there. And as you, I think it was Adrian Brandt mentioned, but you alluded to as well, but some of these electronic upgrades are going to enable gate downtime improvements. Is that correct?
That I'm not sure about.
Okay,
Yeah.
maybe I misunderstood.
Yeah. So it's the pre-signal is for safety.
Okay.
For safety.
Okay. Well, optimizing gate downtimes, I recall was something that XCAP had looked at to some degree. Nadia, do you remember?
Yeah, but more of it had to do with how the new system would talk to the signals. So I don't know where we are on that stuff. I wouldn't say, but I think it would be good to get clarification on the other thing that Adrian said, which was whether it's true that if you couple, I read in the staff report that Palo Alto Avenue, that you can't have two quiet zones in a city. They have to all be part of the same zone. And if you could speak to whether including Palo Alto Avenue changes the risk factor and whether we have to do 2 or 3.
I meant to go back to that because that was a public comment. Yes, because there's no there can only be one quiet zone, the way the 4 crossings are configured. And so the way we did our analysis is we did assume, because Palo Alto Avenue is going first, we did assume that the improvements that are currently slated there are already part of that. And so yes, they are, so to speak, not getting credit for it, but you are treating it as that future existing condition. So all 4 crossings were examined together. As a part of that analysis, though, it did not require any additional improvements to Palo Alto Avenue, but it was included in the overall risk analysis, if that makes sense.
Okay. And then I did want to mention a couple of the speakers talked about the number of trains that Caltrain is running compared to the ridership, and a bit of a chicken and egg issue that with electrification and quieter trains, Caltrain is running fewer trains than they pre-COVID they ran at rush hours, particularly at the baby bullet stations, but more trains throughout the day and some more trains very early in the morning and late at night. It's a valid question of what will be the ridership at those times and the trade-off that will happen. And that trade-off, of course, is affected by electrified trains or those new trains, but they are quieter than they were previously. And then what happens on horn blasting. Caltrain is, because they developed a business plan a couple years before COVID, which had projections of basically capacity constraints. They were already at rush hour at overcapacity, standing room only. And their projection was they're going to need to run more trains for increased ridership growth. And that's no longer the case, but they're only next year going to be starting an update to the business plan to reflect not only what are the current post-COVID conditions, but what does that mean for the future? And I'll just say that transit agencies in general, up until now, have kind of wanted to up until this last year, said, well, let's get past COVID and see what really returns to normal and how long. And I think that there was an anticipation that the changes that occurred from COVID were transitory. And they're finally now recognizing that there are long-term impacts. And they've got to figure out what that's going to mean. They don't have the answers yet, but that'll be reviewed next year, is my understanding. And I had pushed hard for that as soon as possible, because I just think the agencies are still operating too much from historic assumptions, and they were reasonable assumptions at the time. Okay, anything else? Nadia?
I was just going to correct one thing. There was a speaker who talked about trying to figure out how to time the train so that at least they pass in the intersections at roughly the same time. That's not really possible because that's only considering the one intersection. Obviously, Caltrain has to run a schedule that fits the entire line and not center its trains around Palo Alto. So unless anyone think that that was a possibility, it's really not. It'd be great, but it's not possible.
Yeah, and even if even a given location, it's difficult. What Caltrain does to keep trains on schedule is they'll delay a train leaving a station if they to get on schedule. And right now, without level boarding, trains stay at stations longer than they typically need to board the passengers, because they have to build into the modeling what if we have someone in a wheelchair or otherwise needs, they have lifts there. And so they have to factor in an average, and they have to be conservative so they don't run behind schedule. So basically the train schedule is slower than it could be because each stop on average has longer than they really need to accommodate that unknown, and it's a variable. And until we have level boarding, that can't be addressed.
On the plus side, the one thing I will say is travel time and frequency are really important issues for commuters. And the new electrified service will save is said to save 6 minutes between San Francisco and Palo Alto Avenue station, and 14 minutes between Palo Alto and Gilroy. So 20 minutes total savings on the thing. So
is that, so there are two different savings. So the service plan, basically, rather than focusing on the baby bullets running faster, what we have are trains that are going to accelerate faster, but translate that into more stops at the lesser stations. So when you're saying that, Philip, are you referring to the express trains or the standard trains?
That's actually just the high level information they have on their website. I pulled that a little while ago.
I think, but I'm not.
I haven't seen the final schedules yet, so I think that's really gonna.
Yeah. So I believe that applies to trains that are having more stops, but most of the trains will have more stops now. And we won't have. It could have been translated. There's a tough decision they had, which is, do you make the baby bullet even quicker? And they said, no, let's make all the trains have more stops, and those basically the local trains will now have significantly faster service, and the trains are not running at a higher peak speed. The benefit is really the acceleration rate under electrification.
Yeah, so Caltrain has a fact sheet for electrified service plan for City of Palo Alto. So that's where the 6 minutes saved and the 14 minutes saved comes from. Okay.
Well, that's I have to go back and maybe we all should have that update too, because it's really one of the things that it's a big deal having this electrification. They're not only faster trains, they have Wi-Fi, they're modern, they're like business class, they have USB ports, they have bathrooms that are nice on board. And there's, I think, understandably, there's a lot of excitement. One of the parties that I neglected to mention on the kickoff event, and really one of the beneficiaries is like chambers of commerce, because as all the cities on the corridor are looking to revitalize their downtowns, coming by transit is really valuable. And it doesn't have the parking impacts, the traffic impacts, et cetera. And so there's a lot of beneficiaries to this, but we also have the reality that we're at 40% of prior ridership. They expect that and this is only an estimate, that maybe another 20% in ridership will come about as a result of electrification, which would still keep the system well below its pre-COVID level. All right, so then we just need to focus on on the
Yeah.
questions.
We want to go ahead with some other questions
You
now
bet.
we've heard the public. Very, very briefly, Councilmember Lithcott Hames and I, just before we came on air, said, "Oh, there's a lot of numbers here." And, you know, strictly for the benefit of the public, not because we need it, of course, but could somebody take us through page 7, table 1, to kind of get to what the risk factors are and all the quantification there? I mean, that might be a language to you folks, but I'm not sure it is to us. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm sorry. We're engineers who like to deal with numbers and things like that,
That's why I said that might communicate to you.
So I think it's just the key thing is there's a risk value, and the higher the number, the higher the risk. And so it's doing a before and after analysis of the goal would be with putting in these safety improvements, SSMs, you get that number below that $258,000 number. So
Could we get page 7 up? This is page 8.
This is not right.
The one before it.
Table 1.
They're both called table 1s.
Oh,
It's the one that shows.
no. I get-
It's the one that has 426,000 for West Charleston. It's the first.
That's table 2.
Okay, it's called table 1 in the printout. No. It's the one that's called existing SSM and risk values associated with. I'm in the staff report.
There's also a table in the city staff report. with the same-
which are it's the same information. But then so to calculate that initial risk value, there's a risk value assigned for each of the intersections. It's a site specific value assigned by FRA as a function of, number of crossings and traffic and all those things, but that's basically a set value. The fact that Charleston is at 426 speaks to that being a crossing with a higher risk of incidents, which is everyone's personal experience. So that's a right, and then you take an average of that, and that's where you get that 258,000 across the 4. You average the risk across all 4 crossings, and so then the preceding tables will we do the analysis of showing, well, hey, if you add in this SSM, what does it do to your risk value, and when do you get below that 258,000? And those would be potential opportunities for getting a quiet zone implemented.
You've actually got on this slide that I'm looking at that was attached to the staff report, it looks like all but Palo Alto Avenue are way above the risk index with horns. The risk index with horns, which we're told we cannot exceed, is 258,000 something. And Churchill is 588,000, East Meadow is 295, West Charleston is 426. I just couldn't understand how. This is the table that says existing SSM and risk values. So why are our numbers, there we go. That's the one I'm talking about. I just didn't know how to read it. It looks like terrifying somehow, like we're in trouble. These numbers are so much bigger than this sort of numbers in bold, which seem to be some kind of threshold not to be exceeded.
Well, it's the threshold you can't exceed to get it approved as a quiet zone. So all that means is you have to implement SSMs that will lower the risk at each crossing. And if you can get to the point where you can bring that total average below that risk index, then you do have the potential for getting a quiet zone approved.
So just to be clear, you're saying it's the ratio that decides whether we're meeting the threshold.
I would say it's the average of the risk values across all 4 crossings.
Okay.
But they don't say what you're doing there. Most of them are zeros to begin with. So we're not seeing a math plus or minus after you do the SSMs.
So sorry, the pre-SSM there, you'll see that those are the safety measures included in this calculation are the ones that we are planning for Palo Alto Avenue. That's why that one has them. The other ones do not have any. When this was evaluated, this is before any safety measures have been.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's why there's 13 there at Palo Alto Avenue. Those are the 13 that we're planning to implement as the part of the Quiet Zone project.
And there's a table farther back that describes it's just a numbering system, and 13 just means you add additional concrete medians on either edge of the crossing. 1 through 14 all mean something slightly different. Either it's all different types of SSMs are evaluated. There are some as drastic as closing the crossing or grade separating the crossing, but neither of those are within the context of our discussion here. Most of them involve around some elements of adding additional gating or signaling or medians extending to and from the crossing.
So to Council Member Lithcott Haynes's sort of question, I think, I just asked ChatGPT, which I'm not saying is a good place to go ask questions.
Okay.
But it does talk about, it says for 2024, the nationwide risk threshold is about 14,008, and our numbers seem to be way higher than that. So I guess my question is, even if we go through this exercise, are we guaranteed that as long as that ratio that we're talking about works, we will be approved for Quiet Zone, or is there still a chance that they still say our intersection is too risky, even with quad gates, and we can't get the Quiet Zone?
I think this does go back to the recommended options that Philip was speaking about. If you proceed, my understanding is if you proceed with option 1, which is
Do them all.
to do SSMs at every crossing. Oh,
Yeah, sorry. So yeah, that's my understanding is that if we did the quad gates at all the intersections, along with the other things that are happening for the other project, that it would automatically qualify because that's the FRA's guidelines.
Okay, so there isn't a world in which if we did everything that they asked, they couldn't still come back and say, we think this is still too dangerous for whatever reason the FRA could come back with.
that's not an option we're considering. If you're looking at the option 1 and option 2, when you get into option 3.
Sure, no, I understand, but it's
subjective and less prescriptive.
Okay, yeah.
But yeah, option 1 is a prescriptive option.
I was going to move off of that then. So my questions originally, which have shifted a little bit based on what I'm hearing. First is, we already talked about that. We can't make a decision between these options unless we know what it costs, because obviously option 1 is the best. So getting, further cost. And
Sure.
you've given us the slide to say you're not trying to get there today. But what are the funding sources besides those grants? Would it go to straight CPIs and we just calculate them in terms of our normal operating budget? I mean, particularly if it's in the 200K range, which is not a big number.
Yeah, so I believe that we'll need to look into that. The answer is there's grant funds that we would look at for these projects. So we would look to try and identify possible grant opportunities. But there is potential that we have funding that could be used from other grade separation sources, or I should say rail grade separation sources.
Yeah. So my next question, well, that was actually 2 cost and funding sources. But my next question is now going to be reversed. I was going to say, does it make sense to spend this money if we're going to do grade crossings? Now I'm going to reverse the question and say, if we're delaying grade crossings, as we might based on the one data point from Burlingame, should we try to be accelerating this, which takes me back to the CPIs? Would that be a quicker way to get the money to fund it?
Just to be clear, Councilmember, I think you mean CIPs, meaning our own capital improvement program. Just to be clear, as opposed to CPI.
No.
Which, since you off on a whole different tangent.
Yeah, that would be a tangent. Yeah, just normal CIPs is what I'm saying in the capital budgeting process.
So I think to answer that, I would go about it a different way. I would say regardless of the grade separation project, staff's recommendation would be to continue to expedite this process for quiet zones. That's the path we've been taking with Palo Alto Avenue, is trying to, get these studied, create concepts, get rail committee council's approval, and then get the FRA and CPUC approval so that we can implement, because these can provide, and we've heard this from the community, this provides a real community health benefit to, the sooner we can implement them.
Yeah, so that
So-
addresses my reverse question that I just asked, which is, we should try to expedite this now because we may not even be putting up grade steps somewhere, so we might as well get on with it. Then my last related question is, you say in the last, you say there's funding for this quiet zone study, but is what you call the preliminary plan, is that more dollars that you need?
No, the funding's already identified for
Okay.
that.
Okay. I didn't know if you're making a distinction between you finish the zone study and now you have to go to preliminary plans. Okay, so there's no, as you say here, there's no resource impact.
No.
Okay.
Well, yeah, there's a resource impact, but it's already been identified and
Yeah.
programmed. Yes.
Yeah.
In the CIP. Yeah. With CPI.
That's right. Calculated in. Okay,
Ed, can I go to your reversal with a twist?
okay.
I thought you were going to also ask, and what is the cost of these wayside horns and how much time do they take? Because if grade step is farther away because of Burlingame, and we can do these quiet zones now, and we can do the horns even more quickly, that is intuitive. They're just putting some horns on existing things. I imagine, maybe it's more complicated than that, but I imagine it's faster. Why would we not be looking at horns, then quiet zone, as a sort of 1-2 punch strategy? And forgive me if I've missed on the conversation about cost, what the cost of waste.
Yes, no, sorry. We would have to refine that further in the next phase of this. So
Under that very theme, Christine's going to pull up what I was provided of a study in Iowa of sound contours, comparing the top one being a on locomotive horn and the lower one wayside horns. And that's a very pronounced sound contour. And
Yeah.
when we see the red spots, now I don't know if there's any differentiation in intensity of red spots. So that's where you'd have wayside and the local impact.
Yeah.
But it's in the same decibel category as what we get on a big area. And then look at how many people are impacted in the yellow, which is still pretty darn bad, which may be where you are, or in the red. It's probably actually in the red, actually, is where our attendees are. And then, so that's really,
Encouraging.
yeah, it's a big impact.
Nobody is made worse.
yeah, so thank you so much. This image is really helpful. I actually just saw this came through my email as well. Yeah, so that really speaks to the localized impact that we talked about with the wayside horns. To answer your question, in this next phase, that's when we would figure out whether that would be a good interim measure. Right now, that's why we're saying it could be something that we'd recommend as interim. If, for example, we think that it's going to take us longer to get together the funding, or that this is going to take longer to construct or something like that, and we could potentially implement the wayside horns faster. Now, it might be that they're not significantly cheaper than what we need to do, and that they're not going to come any quicker, and then might, rail committee and council might determine that they'd rather go with the full implementation of quiet zones where there's no noise and less. And just, I do want to explain this for members of the public that might be listening. It doesn't mean that a horn will never sound. The Caltrain could still use their horns if there's something, in their way, they see something that they want to make a warning, so they would still use their horns. This would just be the regular horns that are sounded at each time they pass through.
I want to flip that like you're flipping. Because it may be that the wayside horns solve 90% of the problem and we don't need to do the rest of this stuff. And if they are cheaper and quicker? Like, who knows? It sounds like we just don't know, but I think these are the key questions to be asking. We either have things that have to happen in series or one is a lot better than the other. And I think that's what I'm going to be interested in knowing next. Yeah.
I'll just say these images are more striking than I had anticipated.
Yeah.
And if we look at the areas that have red and yellow, how much benefit we could get quickly, we think. I mean, assuming that wayside horns would be quicker to implement, that's pretty striking.
It's important to know that the bells will still ring. So this is one aspect of the noise, but the bells still have to ring because when the gates come down, the bells
Right.
ring. And that's a CPUC rule.
Yeah, okay, so won't eliminate that, but either way it won't.
No,
right?
yeah. And one other thing to note is apparently the Atherton quad gates cost about $600,000 for just one intersection. Now, I don't know what they're, to Brad's point, it's very site specific. I don't know what they needed. They might have needed way more stuff than what we need because we're already getting some improvements. I couldn't find any wayside horns currently on the Caltrain line, but the best thing I was able to compare it to is Metrolink has one in Monrovia, California, and it costs them about $150,000. So I think it's probably a lot cheaper, but to your point, I don't know
And
what, and
it'll be
faster,
interesting to learn
maybe.
how much quicker it is to implement. Philip, I assume you don't know from an approval standpoint. Do you know anything on the process of wayside horn approval versus the quiet zone approval? That would be a valuable follow-up.
Yeah, no,
if you're able to
that's
find that out.
information we can find
Great.
in this next phase.
Great. I suspect, but we don't know, that it could be a lot faster. And so, could we get 90% improvement really quickly? That would be good. Okay, and one other consideration, and you kind of alluded to it somewhere, but when looking at the physical measures needed to establish a quiet zone, some of it, I think, is contextual in terms of what are the sorts of incidents that occur. The type that occur out in the country or whatever may be different from cars getting stuck on our tracks here and those kinds of things. And whether quad gates are the ideal and best approach here, whereas they may be elsewhere, that's something I'm going to be interested in understanding. And it's that context of the location and the types of incidents that occur that we're trying to reduce or eliminate. I'm not assuming we have answers today, but I just want to frame that as one of the considerations.
Yeah, I'm assuming Blake wants to speak to this because I think, just to be clear, it's not the specific, it's based on the FRA's calculator, which provided those confusing numbers. Sorry about that, but the FRA's calculator for quiet zones and the measures that they will accept for dealing with those measures. Blake, did you?
Just to elaborate on that, there's 14 SSMs that they are the first S is standard. So it's standard measures they will consider. I alluded to them earlier, but like some of those measures are just literally closing the crossing to traffic, grade separating the crossing, which are things that have already been discussed. But then gates or long medians that extend the length. But this goes back to the context specificity. The median, we cannot develop a long enough median length due to the proximity to intersections, proximity to driveways, which is why we did not study those alternatives. So we already attempted to be context specific, and the only SSM that would be applicable here would be a quad gate system.
One other small thing that comes to mind is as you started talking about those medians, it may not overlap, but as part of we have a bike and pedestrian master plan update that's occurring. One thing that struck me yesterday when I was riding on Park is that I think it's at Meadow when you cross, there's no safe island for bikes that are crossing. It doesn't have a flashing light, and there's no refuge island. It's only like a short distance. And so we may want to just make sure that as we go forward that we're integrating any bike and pedestrian necessary safety improvements with what we're doing on design here. There may not be an overlap, but there may very well be. Okay, Ed?
I just have one quick question. In fact, it just came up, but you said towards the end here, you said due to community goals and the surrounding street geometry, the only feasible SSM was quad gate. And what are you using as community goals there?
There's just it's not a community goal to close the crossing,
Okay.
just things like closing the crossing, closing driveways, closing left turn pockets. That was broadly what I was referring to with community goals.
Okay, I was wondering what community goals were guiding this, so that answers
Keeping the crossing open.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, so even though we have this FRA scoring, I think we want to have as good of an understanding as we can of how it will actually address the safety in our context. So they may have a scoring system that really isn't connected, but I want to just make sure that we're looking at the instance we have and what we appraise as the safety impacts of our measures, regardless of how it scores for them. Okay, so we've kind of given you,
Yeah.
Julie, sorry.
Did you have more questions? Okay, I just have a couple questions left. One is really big picture zooming out. It feels like currently train safety approaches are a belt and suspender approach. The train has to do some things, blare a horn, and the intersection has to do some things, put down gates and ring bells to protect the public. And, so with the feds saying you can establish quiet zones, like the train doesn't have to blare its horn, it's like removing the suspenders, just really relying on that belt. Like the second option is amplified, is made more secure. And it begs the question then, how safe are the gates and the bells? And I trust every time I go up to them, like, these are going to work. These are going to work. If there's a train coming, these are going to work. Do we have any sense as to, the failure rate of these things on an annual basis, on a systems basis? Do they ever fail? Because it just feels, obviously the feds think it's possible. The horn doesn't have to be blared if these certain things come down in accordance with their specifications. But what if they don't? How often does that happen? Or is it so close to nil that we just don't have to worry about it?
Well, I'll just say two things to that. Number one, if a gate fails, that's a situation where Caltrain's going to use their horn. So they're going to know that the gates failed. They're going to use their horn. So that would be a situation where they use their horn. The other thing I'll say is you might have experienced this before, but the gates more often when they fail, it's in the down position rather than the up position. There's a reason for that.
Yeah, I was going to get to, they're designed to fail safe. So if it fails, they will fall down.
So aside from the fail safe issue, Julie's comments made me reflect on something that Caltrain's not a fan of quiet zones because they actually fear that it will impede safety even with the measures. But clearly the FRA allows it with certain measures. Something we hadn't talked about is now that we're looking at those sound contours, what if we wanted to look at quad gates and other quiet zone type measures combined with wayside horns as opposed to horn elimination? If we get 90% reduction in horn noise and safety measures that continue to make the crossings, make them safer than they are, and we only blast the horns on a limited basis exactly where needed, does that make it a much quieter, not quite as quiet as elimination of horns, and a safer intersection? And does that frankly go into looking at if we don't have $400 million for Churchill, is that a best practice? And I don't know the answer, but it made me realize that is that something we should be looking at?
That was sort of a question for the future. Okay. My last question I think here is, I was a little confused about why it is that a system like ours with 4 crossings could be established as a quiet zone if not all the intersections were addressed. So why is it that two of the three can, is an option? Why would the feds grant us that as a safety? My real question is, does that mean the train doesn't blow its horn on the one that hasn't been fixed, or it's only blowing its horn on the one that hasn't been fixed? Therefore, 3 out of 4 have been fixed. The horn only blows 1/4 of the time. Therefore, it's still a safe zone. Like, which is it?
That's a very good question. And I will try and answer it correctly, but I think, because again, they're just viewing it as a mathematical approach and getting that average risk across all the crossings down. And what we were able to demonstrate through that study is that if you still improve 2 of the 3 crossings, your average risk level will decrease, which means that the feds should grant a quiet zone based on information, which means that unimproved crossing would still be part of the quiet zone.
Meaning it's an unimproved crossing, the engineer will not blow the horn.
They are not mandated to blow the horn.
Okay. Thank you.
For clarification, the other advantage of the quiet zone is the quad gates that help make sure cars still don't try to go around the gates and get in. So there is a secondary benefit that isn't related to being quiet.
Yeah.
That still provides a benefit that, for example, at Churchill would probably be really welcome, because you sometimes still get people who decide they're
That's
going to
right.
go
Of
around.
course. It makes vehicle movement safer.
That's the primary purpose. Yeah, primary engineering purpose.
Yes.
And are you allowed to eliminate noise because you've made them that much safer? And I'll just toss out one other thing, because as we were earlier on, kind of starting to talk about the concept of, well, what if we put off Churchill hypothetically for indefinitely? The other reason, or one of the other major reasons that we were looking at grade separating there and elsewhere, is the congestion impact. We already have significant congestion. It's not as bad as it was before the changes from COVID. And we don't have the projected increase in gate downtime from additional trains, even though Caltrain hasn't rejected their increase in trains service plan, where they were going to go up to over 150 trains an hour. It's unlikely that that's anywhere on the horizon. What if we had we've had a lot of discussion over time in signal optimization, and really reducing the gate downtime through really optimizing that. So if we have quad gates, wayside horns, and signal optimization, are we looking at an alternative to a grade separation?
Yes.
And that we've reduced the traffic, drastically reduced the noise, and made the intersection safer, along with these other measures that we're doing in the near term, that, for instance, at Churchill, by both our actions and Caltrain, will be making that safer. So out of when we were looking at our objectives on a grade separation, how many could we do at a fraction of the cost? And we haven't really had that discussion, but I think it's worth reflecting on, especially as we're kind of looking at a different era now from what we were assuming several years ago. So that's not something we're going to resolve today, but let me punt that back to you and let all of you noodle about that. Yeah. Sorry, do we have another speaker? No.
Sure.
Okay, thank you. All right. So we've given a bunch of feedback. It's not exactly, well, we've reviewed and discussed, certainly. Do you have the feedback you need? There's still a lot of open questions we have that I think we'd like, before just this running down the tracks with this plan, that we get as much at an upcoming meeting as answers to some of these additional questions, and maybe we could agendize it that way. But Philip, do you think you've got enough for now, and then you would be able to move forward? Do you need this
Yeah, I
to go
think-
to the council as a recommendation?
Yeah, I'm not sure that it needs to go to council. I need to, unfortunately,
This is for the study, right?
Yeah.
So I
So I
think
think-
the cost approximately of this next phase of the study.
oh, I'm sorry, I don't have that. I don't have
Okay.
that handy. I'd have to look that up. But sorry, just to be clear about what I'm looking for today is really the direction to proceed with developing the concepts and.
Yeah, I thought
those
it was
other things
bullet
that are
point one.
in the
Yeah,
next
and not
steps.
to narrow them,
Yes.
looking at all four still.
I mean, if you believe that you could narrow them at this time,
I'm kind of
otherwise,
thinking 1 and 4.
Me too.
yeah, so that would be what staff would recommend, or what
Good.
staff's recommendation is to consider 1 and 4
Good.
as well.
I think we're all in
And that would be
consensus.
really helpful if rail committee feels comfortable with that.
Great.
But you don't have to go to any other bullet points then, right?
Bullet points.
On slide number, whatever it is.
On this slide that's up on the board,
Nope.
you're talking about on the next
Lines to
steps.
Incorporate feedback.
No, that's all stuff we'll need to do. So we'll need to, that'll be all part of the concepts that we refine in the next steps. So these are all
What I'm
gonna,
asking you is, do you have to do a diagnostic meeting and community outreach, or are you gonna do this stuff first and then come back to us before the other bullet points happen?
so we'll develop concepts and then we'll take those concepts for like community feedback and all that and then bring it back to rail committee for feedback, approval and direction to council.
Well, and those concepts could come to us even before you have a community outreach.
That's why I'm asking the question, wondering if that's a better batting order.
Yeah, or concurrently, just.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Could I also recommend that if you're going to do community outreach, it's been a while since we've updated the community on all of the things that have been happening, both the sort of very short-term Churchill improvements, where we are on, the longer-term improvements. So you're probably going to want a good primer for people about what's really happening. All along because people see stuff going on, they just don't know what it is. Nighttime work, and some stuff isn't even us, it's just Caltrain on their own. So all of those things, I think anything you can communicate is helpful.
Could I add, I feel like some of the questions we've been asking today about cost and time frame for option 1 and option 4 are really germane. Like to Pat's point about this could conceivably be an alternative to a grade separation project or more.
Or at least for
for
10, 20 years.
For 10, 20 years. I mean, this is exciting and a massive switch in thinking potentially. And we're getting there because we're kind of excited by what we're hearing, but there's been no dollars or time frame attached to it. So I think it's dangerous to do any kind of conversation with the public in a speculative sense about this until we know with greater confidence that this is potentially, a pretty exciting plan B. And I just don't think we know that yet. So I would like to.
That's why I'm bringing it up, is
Yeah.
that we can't, we always want to do community outreach, but the when is the question here. And it seems to, we just had a very good discussion, but it's still quite general. We don't have the costs, costing the alternatives, looking at these combinations of ingredients. What does that mean in terms of impact on grade steps? And we have an example in the community right now of well-intentioned community outreach on the airport, causing all kinds of consternation in the press and in the public and so on. And something with this many changes, I don't think should go out until it's pretty well baked here in committee.
That's a good point. And I was, we have rail committee meetings monthly. I would guess that some of our questions, we could have some response even by the next meeting. Not necessarily all of them, and maybe we agendize a follow-up discussion on that basis. And we're all kind of digesting a lot of scenarios that we've been thinking, and I think it's been real constructive today. But I think we need to digest. You as staff probably and consultants want to go back and talk about them and think about them a little bit, as well as come up with any concrete answers to specific questions.
Yeah, I was just going to quickly respond. Even if we're not talking about not grade separating Churchill, even if we're still planning to do that, let's just say we're still moving forward with all the same plans as we've had previously. I think it's realistic to say that since Meadow Charleston have been prioritized, that it would be a long time before we can pull together all the funding to actually construct a third location. So it's a lot of money for each of these grade crossings that we're going to have to pull together, get grant funding, pull all of these different funding sources together, following all the other design phases that we're in. So I think it's reasonable to say that at the minimum, these could be interim measures that could provide benefit.
That's right. And, you know, with all the legitimate concern on the potential property impacts on Churchill, which we think that there are design changes that could significantly reduce or eliminate them. It's still, it's, you know, it's a big concern, and we're alarming the community on something that we're all kind of thinking that's not likely to happen for 10 or 20 years, but we aren't at a point to be able to tell the community clearly that that's the case. But we were looking at kind of a binary choice, essentially do nothing or do the full thing. And now we're starting to look at it in between to last us 10 or 20 years, and maybe longer. Okay.
And sorry, just to come back to your earlier question about cost, just to say that the cost of this study are all budgeted within our CIP. I don't have the numbers for it right now, so I'd have to dig into that. My SMA could find it for me, but it's all in the existing budget that we have planned.
Great.
So do we want to move the staff recommendation, which was to study these two option 4 and option 1 further?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So moved.
Second. Oh, there we go. Second. All in favor? Aye. That passes unanimously. All right. Yeah.
Sorry, who got the second there? Did
Ed.
clerk catch that?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
And then just briefly, upcoming meetings. One of the things that I had discussed with Philip in the last week is an interest in getting an update from our consultants from our bike and ped master plan as they relate to station access and circulation. So getting to stations and moving about in the station areas, primarily the university station there. And a reason for wanting to do that is we now have a $1 million grant from VTA for a portion of the design study on future use designs at CalAb, but we also, of university, but we also have the quarry extension, and that's going to address circulation. Then on top of that, Caltrain has their station access plan, where they're now having corridor-wide looking in partnership with the cities about station access. And we could have them present on their station access plan. That won't go into details that for our location, but it's a context that now Caltrain is thinking the same way at these various stations. We've got to look at, we're going to have transit is how do you get there? And in particular, how do you get there without driving a car? And so that may not be the only thing that we would have at that meeting, but I just wanted to say that that's a potential topic for our next meeting.
Yeah, if I can, unfortunately, that item will not be ready for the meeting in September, but they do have it scheduled for the bicycle and.
Well, when you say it's not ready, what do you mean? I'm not necessarily looking. Frankly, my preference would be to have the discussion before they finalize. I want to see where they are right now so that we can have input so that their final draft will have incorporated the input as opposed to wait until they got that. And then we go, well, no, you left this and this and this out. Let's go backward.
So the consultant, staff, and city council approved a scope, which included several items, and they are currently in a phase where they're taking all of the input that they received and pulling it together. And then they had plans to bring that feedback to the committees before bringing it to council. And so I understand that you want to make sure that you're providing feedback, not just saying these are the answers. That will be an opportunity, but they need to get all of their stuff ready for that. And so there's a timing aspect to that.
And what do they have an estimate on when?
Yeah, so it's either going to be October or November. So not significantly after the September, but certainly they won't have an item ready to print for next week for this.
Can you check with them on whether they really feel they have adequate input to be providing a draft that is reflective of a whole bunch of considerations, including ones that are kind of emerging as a result of discussions we're having with Stanford on the whole quarry, the impact of the quarry extension on circulation, and I'm not sure that they have that input right now.
So I'll just say that they have been receiving and paying attention to everything else that's been going on,
Okay.
including Quarry Road, El Camino Real, all of that stuff has been considered as
Okay.
part of their inputs. And along with anything else that's happened.
Okay,
But I will say that they're going to come here and also be receptive to input. That's going to be,
good.
this is, I want to make sure it's clear. We're in phase 3 right now of 5. And so this next phase is taking all the possible identified projects and plans and things like that and getting committee review of them, making sure we're not missing anything that the committees think that we're missing, making sure that, you know, we've got the right list basically.
Okay.
So that is
Right.
the process, but I just want to let you know that your requested timing doesn't quite match up with our actual schedule that they're
Okay.
working on.
Well, hopefully we can get in the October meeting then. And then at that one, I think it would be good to have, whenever we do have it, have Caltrain present their access plan, which that wouldn't be a long presentation, but just to make sure the two things are looked at the same time. And then, so then what did you have tentative, if anything, for the September agenda?
Yeah, so we're hoping to have that 3-party agreement ready for the September agenda.
On the preliminary design?
Yeah, for the
engineering.
preliminary engineering and environmental, yes.
And that'll be a tentative agreement, I guess, will that'll be the parties' roles who would also really define the scoping and the RFP parameters, or is it upstream of that?
I think that will be upstream of that, but it could contain some components of that.
Okay, well, then we
So-
could have a discussion, if it, all the better if it's upstream, we could have a discussion about any thoughts on what we want to make sure is.
Yeah, I think
yeah.
Yeah, so I think the key to the agreement is really about the funding. It's about,
Okay.
you know, not just funding, I should say, but funding and what that funding means for roles and responsibilities.
Okay,
So like
the concrete
Caltrans,
part
yes,
will be about that. And
yes,
we could have additional input discussion around the kind of the scope of the RFP.
correct.
Great. All right.
Philip, does that mean that that's time sensitive, meaning at the next meeting, they have to be able to agree to what that is because we have a timetable that comes from the FRA and where this money is coming from?
Not necessarily,
Okay.
but I can't speak definitively on that, but I do not believe that that's necessarily something that we want, that's going to hold us up too much if it was to delay another meeting or so.
Okay.
But it is something that is sort of time sensitive because we do need to proceed into this next phase.
Okay, but it's not this is your day and if you don't do it, then we won't make it.
I think not, but that's still something that's we need to discuss with our grantor.
Okay, thank you.
All right. On that note, I think we can adjourn. Thanks.